Okay, I think we'll begin, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to begin by welcoming you and asking you to join me in taking your phone or other noise-making device and switching it onto off or silent or vibrate or something like that so that it does not suddenly speak up in the middle of this. So thanks very much for joining us. I'm Hussein Ibish. I'm Senior Resident Scholar here at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. I also like to welcome everybody who's watching us online. Turns out to be quite a large audience for these events, so I appreciate that. Today we're going to look at regional reactions to turmoil and unfolding developments in the Middle East. And it's titled Shake Up in the Middle East, How Will Regional Powers Respond? And we're going to have a conversation among ourselves for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, and bring you in and hear what you have to say. But we've got a terrific panel with us today. And so I'm just going to introduce them, and then we'll start. To my immediate left is Professor F. Gregory Gause III. He's Professor of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M, and also is a member of our board of directors here at AGSIW. So it's a particular pleasure to have Professor Gause with us. And then to his left is Gönül, who is founding director of the Center for Turkish Studies at the Middle East Institute. And there are more details on all of our panelists in your pamphlet if you want their detailed bios. And finally, at the end of our table here at the far end is an old friend who I haven't seen for a long time, but I'm really delighted that he could come and join us, Ambassador Feisal al-Istrabadi, who is a professor and founding director at the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University, and also a noted scholar of law and international relations, and who also served from 2004 to 2007 as Iraq's deputy permanent representative, that is the ambassador at the United Nations, which is really great. So we have here an enormous amount of experience and information and talent to look at the upheavals that I was talking about in the Middle East. So just to give you a sense of the kind of thing that's underway, I think you all know, but it's worth remembering that in the past few weeks, we've had the United States withdrawal from the JCPOA and basically killing the Iran nuclear deal. How long it walks around as a zombie, we'll see, but it's fundamentally dead or dying. We've had the election in Iraq, which turned out very as messily as one had expected, and now months of intense politicking kicking in there. An election in Lebanon that went very well for Hezbollah and their friends, but not so well for pretty much everybody else. The war in Syria continues to kind of metastasize in odd and disturbing ways. The United States is still there in spite of President Trump's idea of withdrawing. And Turkey continues to experience a great deal of turmoil internally as well as economically. Now we see the currency is in great difficulty. So from all of that, I think we want to look at where these regional powers fit into all of this. And I guess I'd begin by asking Professor Gause in particular, how does the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA affect Saudi Arabia's interests and calculations? What are they thinking right now in Riyadh, do you think?
So I think that the most interesting thing that we have to kind of start with is that it looks like the Trump administration now has a policy on the Middle East. It took them a year, 3 national security advisors and 2 secretaries of state. But I think that they have a direction on the Middle East now, and it's what Secretary Pompeo laid out the other day. And, you would think that that would greatly please folks in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates, because it seems to line the United States up with exactly where they wanted it to be. But I think that it also creates some problems for the Saudis, because this is a very transactional administration, and they're going to want something from the Saudis. And we have a few hints of what they want, right? The talk about sending Saudi troops into Syria. The implication, if you believe the supreme leader of Iran, that the administration is wants the Gulf states to pony up a lot more money. And the possibility, although I haven't seen this bandied about, but it has to be in people's minds, that Saudi Arabia will use its oil power to try to drive the price of oil down, to further squeeze Iran economically. Sanctions from the U.S., lower oil prices from Saudi. This is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people who, although I think the record here is very unclear, but many people believe that the Reagan administration back in the 80s did this deal with Saudi Arabia to drive oil prices down, to squeeze the Soviet Union. And so I think that there might be some expectation that the Saudis are going to do these things, and I don't think that the Saudis are going to react well to any of those. Right? The idea of ground troops in Syria, I think, is beyond what the Saudis are willing to do for all sorts of reasons. I think that the idea of just kind of giving the U.S. billions of dollars in exchange for this new policy is beyond what Saudi Arabia wants to do. And the Saudis have spent the last 2 years trying to push the price of oil back up for their own internal reasons that make a lot of sense from their perspective. So I wonder if the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to be able to play the role that I think Washington is going to assign them in this new strategy.
Great answer. Thank you. Well, we'll come back to that, and maybe we can also think about whether Washington's going to play the role that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are hoping it's going to play, because I think that's maybe an open question too. But let's just bring Turkey into the mix for a second. There's a great deal of change around Turkey and inside Turkey as well. Well, what's the connection there between Turkey's domestic and foreign policies at the moment? Well, how is all of this sort of tremors and earthquakes surrounding Turkey affecting Turkey, both politics and policy right now?
Well, thank you, Hussein. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
I think Turkey's regional, the backbone of Turkey's regional foreign policy, regional policy has become Turkey's Kurdish issue. So if you look at what Turkey is doing in Syria, in the region with Russia and the problems with the US, the Kurdish issue is the key. For a long time, the ruling AKP pursued a Kurdish opening, and I think for electoral considerations and for other reasons in 2015, the ceasefire between the PKK and Turkish state broke down. And since then, there's been conflict going on, and I think the conflict in Syria particularly heightened Turkey's security threat perceptions. So I believe since 2015, for instance, Turkey changed and shifted its Syria policy. When the conflict in Syria started in 2015, Turkey's #1 priority was toppling the Assad regime. But starting from 2015, and that's the year after the US decided to airdrop weapons to the PKK Syrian offshoot, the PYD, fighting against ISIS in the Syrian town of Kobani. And that was also the year when we saw ISIS attacks inside Turkey, and the Syrian Kurds also started connecting those territories. So that heightened Turkey's threat perception, and change led to a shift in Turkey's Syria policy. And now, since then, Turkey's #1 priority in Syria is containing the Kurdish advancements. And with obviously, after the US decided to help and cooperate with the YPG in Syria, there's been the problems. The relationship has been on a downward spiral since that decision. And there was a point just recently when the two countries, there was a risk of a potential clash between the two countries because Turkey threatened to attack another Syrian town called Manbij, where there are US troops. So I think both Turkey's closer ties with Russia and tension with the US and the shift in Turkey's Syria policy, as well as Turkey's Iraq policy too. For a long time, Turkey worked very closely with the Kurdistan regional government, with Barzani especially. But after the KRG's decision to hold an independence referendum, Turkey became a very vocal critic, and in a way alienated the KRG. So when Turkey looks at the region, that's what it sees. Its fear of a Kurdish separatism forms the backbone of its regional policy, and because of that, there are now tensions with the Saudis. Turkish media very often talked about a new cooperation between the Syrian Kurds and the Saudis. So I think that is the Kurdish issue is the key. But of course, Turkey's relations with the European Union, it's a different matter. The Kurdish question plays a role, but it doesn't play the key role there. Turkey's democratic downsliding is a major issue for the European Union. And with the US, other than the Kurdish issue, there are other problems, and I can talk about that.
Thank you. Ambassador Istrabadi, I mean, obviously it's hard to think of Iraq today without focusing on the election. And so what the election kind of makes me wonder is the extent to which, and you can frame your remark however you want about this, but it just strikes me to ask, to what extent Iraq remains essentially a battleground for others in the region to play out their differences and sort of figure out the balance of power through proxies and other battles in Iraq, and to what extent is Iraq starting to reemerge as a state or set of interests with a coherent agenda and kind of a national identity?
Well, first, let me say I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here.
Incredible pleasure to have
you. I collect maps of the Middle East. Actually, not even of the Middle East. I collect maps of Iraq, and as it turns out, the older the map, the more expensive it is. So I have one map from the 16th century, and then at least one map per century after that. And then the closer you come to the 19th century, they become fairly inexpensive, so I have a whole bunch of them from the 19th century. The point is this, and I'm not vouching for the accuracy of any single map that I have. The point is this. If you look at Iraq, you look at Baghdad, in one map, it's a part of the Ottoman Empire. In the next map, it's a part of the Persian Empire. In the next map, it'll be back as a part of the Ottoman Empire. So to a very significant extent, Iraq being sort of a fault line in the Middle East has been, unfortunately, the case for a very long time. And I think it continues to be so now, except there is now a third actor, and that's Saudi Arabia. So we're on the fault line between Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And given the history of Iraq over the last 30 years or so, 25 years, we are at a sort of historically weak moment in our history, at least since the end of the First World War. But we're just sort of now, I think, starting to have had hopes that we might be emerging again, not in the bombastic and oversized terms that that Iraq played under, during Ba'athist Iraq or Saddamist Iraq, but to its sort of natural state. The current prime minister had managed something his predecessor dismally failed to do, and that was to begin to recalibrate Iraq's relations amongst its neighbors. Iran still, of course, has influence, but he was able to, Abadi was able to cool the temperature with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and also to cool the rhetoric with Turkey, which had gotten personal and between Recep Erdogan and Nouri al-Maliki at one point. So there was sort of a moment of hope, I think, for most of us who observe Iraq, that Iraq might indeed be sort of emerging from too long in the shadows and to sort of reassert itself in a positive way to quote the American poet with, I think it's Robert Frost, strong fences make good neighbors. So we were hoping that perhaps we could begin to erect some good fences or strong fences to make good neighbors. I think the moment now has somewhat passed because of this was precisely the moment that the U.S. chose to ratchet up tensions in the region. And I'm reminded of the supposed African saying that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that is destroyed. Iraq has the potential, unfortunately, to be precisely that grass, or at least one of the areas of grass. There are others. But we are a place where Iran has many options. And I will say one thing, if I may, and I've gone on too long, so this will be my last point. I'm not quite certain that I would agree with you agree with the premise of the question that Iran necessarily has proxies in Iraq. There may be some, but the major players in Iraq, some of whom are very closely allied with Iran, still, I'm not certain I would necessarily call them proxies. I think they have their own interests that align with Iran's. Some of them get funding from Iran. They're supported by Iran. All of that I agree with. But they have fundamentally a community of interests. And I think that's a point that could be, that should be remembered because it makes a difference if they're mere proxies as opposed to having a community of interest with Iran.
Would you call them clients or allies or just anything other than proxies?
I use the word allies.
Okay, that makes sense.
But I won't, make a fight over a noun.
No, I just wanted to clarify, but they're not okay. So that makes a lot of sense. So let's then we've got a sense now of the region. Let's bring the United States in a little bit more, and I think I'd like to continue with Professor Gause, thinking about now the kinds of demands that Washington will be making on the Gulf countries that are most closely aligned with Washington, and the expectations of the Gulf countries towards the Trump administration. Where do you think all that is headed? Because there's surely a potential for disappointment on either end, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the remnants of America First in this very activist policy is that the Trump administration is going to want the local actors to be the boots on the ground to the extent that boots on the ground are needed. Whereas I think that our Gulf allies are they're least capable of doing that. When we think about kind of the departures in Saudi foreign policy under King Salman and the Crown Prince, people point to Yemen and say, look at this much more aggressive and military policy. But I think we have to remember a couple of things about that. First, it's not the Saudis aren't using their own ground forces, right? I mean, it's the Emiratis that are using their ground forces and other ground forces. The Saudis are basically contributing from the air, right? Right. And of all the conflict arenas in the region, the one where the Saudis were least likely to directly confront Iran was Yemen. And there's all sorts of other reasons, of course, why the Saudis see Yemen as their backyard and their exclusive area of influence and weren't going to allow the Houthis to dominate the state. But I think that it would be a mistake for us to read into this kind of un-Saudi behavior of using direct military force in Yemen as a willingness to go even further into a place like Syria where they could confront Iran directly. So I think that there might be an inflated expectation on the American side about what the Saudis can do. And I think that there's always been an inflated expectation on the Gulf side of what America can do. I mean, I think we have to remember that the last 3 American elections were won by the candidate who was, if you will, more dovish on the Middle East.
An anti-globalist. Walter Reed always makes that point. He takes it even further back. He'll say 25 years every time.
Well, it's certainly the last 3, right?
No doubt.
And I think that even though we're talking very big about what we want to do to Iran and in Iran and with Iran, I'm not sure that we're willing to. Well, I'm absolutely sure that we're not willing to back it up to the extent that the United States did in 2003.
Right.
And I think in many ways the Gulf states became 2003 became the new baseline. Well, if you're not willing to send a big army to accomplish these goals, you must not care about us anymore. And the talk about how America is leaving the Gulf or leaving the region, when I see no evidence of that, we're just not sending an army of 150,000 people 150,000 soldiers to accomplish our goals.
Right.
I think it bespeaks an inflated sense of what America is willing to do. And so there's that tension. I think there's one more tension that I bring out in the Gulf states themselves. And this is actually from international relations theory, so excuse the academic turn. It'll be temporary, don't leave. So people who write about alliances and talk about what the weaker party in an alliance faces in the dynamic, they talk about the abandonment entrapment syndrome.
Right.
And you can think, and most of the writing about this was about the Western European allies during the Cold War, right? When the United States was particularly bellicose toward the Soviet Union, right? The Western European allies felt that they would be dragged into a war not of their choosing, in which they would be the grass.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? But during those times where the United States was dealing directly with the Soviet Union during détente, the Western Europeans felt that their interests would be abandoned at the table because they're not at the table.
Right.
And I think that we see this going back much further than just the last 10 or 15 years in the Gulf. I think the Gulf states feel that if the United States is trying to make nice to Iran, and this was the fear in the Obama administration, that their interests would be sacrificed because they weren't at the table. But when the United States is taking a confrontational position toward Iran, as during the George W. Bush administration, the Gulf states began to worry that they were going to be dragged into a conflict not of their choosing. And I think that we might see, depending on how America ratchets up vis-a-vis Iran, we might begin to see that strain of the symphony coming back in from the Gulf states.
And we already hear, I think, an American chorus saying, about the Gulf countries and Israel, that they want to hold our coats while we fight their war for them. That's just seeing that absolutely everywhere. So that's on the other side.
I'm glad you brought up Israel because I had forgotten that. But I think that's one other issue on which there might be
pressure.
Expectations that won't be met.
Yeah, on both sides.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Obviously, the disquiet in the Gulf about the move of the embassy to Jerusalem is temporary in terms of headlines, but I think it emphasizes to America's Gulf partners that this administration maybe isn't taking their concerns sufficiently into account. And I think on the American side, the belief that, the Israelis and the Gulf states and the Saudis, they're all on the same page now, might lead to expectations that would be disappointed on the American side.
Yeah, I think you can see that already with Jerusalem, by the way, that there was not the kind of due diligence done on the language of the move and the context of the move that the administration believed it had done. I think that's going to be obvious. Let's actually jump to the end and then come back to Turkey in a second. The United States' role in Iraq. Right now, it's hard to know what kind of a coalition you're going to get. There are lots of ways of doing the math. Most of them involve Muqtada, but not all. So what about the future of the American presence in a military presence in Iraq after the next government is formed, and in general, Iraqi-American relations? Can you talk about that, and then we'll bring Turkey in.
Well, I think that I hope that the lesson learned in 2011 was that the sort of disengagement of the United States from Iraq caused real problems. Because a number of things happened. It wasn't merely that the 100 and some odd, or whatever the numbers were by the time of the withdrawal in, I guess it was December of 2011. It wasn't merely that. It was sort of a break with Iraq, where issues which really mattered to American interests were treated as if they were entirely domestic issues, not to be commented upon by American administration officials. For instance, a warrant for the arrest of the sitting vice president of Iraq on terrorism charges, in which President Obama was prepped to say and did say to Prime Minister Maliki that this is an internal matter that we don't get involved in. Well, that paid big dividends down the road up to and including 2014 and the fall of Mosul, and then the subsequent re-engagement of the United States. There was a break in intelligence sharing and intelligence and military training between the Iraqis and the United States, which again paid big negative dividends in 2014. So my hope is that both sides, the United States and Iraq, have learned that lesson, that an engagement by the United States is sort of in an appropriate sized role, is fundamental. Ryan Crocker.
But just to, you hope so, but what do you expect? I mean, are you just
well, I always
sure?
expect the worst, and I'm rarely wrong. So,
just had to ask. I'm sorry.
I'm only wrong when I'm optimistic.
Yeah, fair enough.
So,
okay. Sorry to have interrupted.
That's a lesson I've learned. Well, I mean, no, I mean, it depends how things are going to go.
Yeah.
You can imagine a scenario in Iraq of things breaking down so that the sort of Hadi al-Amari's list, which is the second list, and state of law and potentially the KDP could try to form a coalition in opposition to some of the other lists, like Muqtada's list and the incumbent prime minister who came in third. In which case it's all up for grabs, and the American role might be somewhat reduced. I would say my colleague, Ms. Toole, said that, and I wrote it down, that Turkey alienated the KRG in light of the referendum. I would argue it was the other way around, by the way, that the KRG alienated Turkey, but more importantly for purposes of your question, the United States and other Western allies, by proceeding with a referendum when they were told that this was not going to end felicitously for them. So there seems to be, on the KDP's part, a kind of a reaction now to swing somewhat towards Iran, away from the United States, away from Turkey. And how that dynamic will play out in terms of the domestic politics, it really is up for grabs. But you can see this sort of anti-American, I suppose, would be the shorthand way of putting it, or at least not pro-American alliance arising and having a major impact on who becomes the prime minister. Fundamentally, in terms of the domestic politics of Iraq, I don't expect any major change. I think we're going to have more of the same.
Yeah.
The question is, has the political class learned that it is, if nothing else, in its own interest and its own interest in surviving, not to disengage from the United States, as both sides wanted to do in 2008 and 8 when the disengagement agreement was signed between the United States and Iraq.
You were going to say something about Ryan Crocker before I interrupted you.
Oh,
I'd
yes.
like to
Ryan Crocker once said that and this still remains true today as it was when he said it was shortly after he ended his stint as ambassador in Baghdad. Ryan said that the Americans are hardwired into the Iraqi political class. I think that remains true. So my hope is that, and there seems to be a fairly effective ambassador there now, as Ryan most certainly was. So my hope is that the United States will continue to be engaged in and with the Iraqi political class to move the country forward. One of the real mistakes that occurred in 2011, again, was this sort of disengagement, including at the political level, where the United States sort of treated Iraq as if it were dealing with Switzerland or somebody.
Right.
And again, the results were rather infelicitous.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Toll, I'd like to sort of bring, switch to Turkey a little bit for a second. But, I mean, the impression a lot of people have, I think, in Washington is that Turkey or Ankara and Washington continuing to drift further and further apart on regional policies. And that Turkey, maybe not on any one single given major bilateral disagreement, but on all kinds of little discrete regional flare-ups and regional tremors, Turkey and the United States are finding themselves pretty consistently on opposite sides of the equation. It's almost easier to imagine Turkey doing business with Russia and in some cases even Iran rather than the United States. So, I mean, do you think that's accurate? Where is the relationship and where is it drifting to? What is all of this?
Well, that's right. There are just too many problems haunting bilateral relations. So the issue of the YPG, U.S. cooperation with the YPG is one of them, but there are others. There's an Islamic cleric living in Pennsylvania since 1999, and the Turkish government is accusing him of orchestrating the failed coup, Fethullah Gülen. So his extradition is a major problem. U.S. officials are saying that it's up to the courts, and Turkey has to provide hard evidence. And until now, Turkey has failed to provide that hard evidence. So I think that will remain a problem. And recently, there was a case in a Manhattan court where, and also that ties into what we were talking about, the Iran deal. Halkbank is a state-owned Turkish bank, and a senior manager there, he was sentenced to 32 months in prison by a Manhattan court on charges of evading U.S. sanctions on Iran. And so Turkey, that's a major problem. Turkish government is saying that this is a political case, it's not a legal case, but that is a problem, and I think there will be more problems because the U.S. Treasury will ask Halkbank to pay a fine, and that's one of the options that the U.S. Treasury has. It could also cut off the bank and several other Turkish banks from the international money transfer system SWIFT. And if that happens, again, that will be another problem. So there are just so many problems, and I feel like, so these are all contextual problems, but there's something that's more structural. And that is, so if you look at Turkey-U.S. relations starting from the Cold War years, there were always problems. And for instance, there were three major crises in 1964 about Cyprus and the famous Johnson letter when President Johnson asked Turkey not to intervene in Cyprus. In 1974, the U.S. Congress imposed sanctions, arms embargo. And finally, 2001, when Turkey decided not to allow U.S. troops to use Turkish airbase. So those were major crises, and the relationship survived. And I think the reason why it survived was that there were always ruling center-right parties and Turkish military. They were the main drivers of a pro-American Turkish foreign policy. For instance, the 1964 and 1974 crises could be solved because there was a new military junta leadership in 1980 who came and said, you know, we cannot afford to break ties with the U.S., and they pushed for normalization. About the 2001 crisis, the ruling party, the current ruling party, AKP, believe it or not, it was one of the most pro-American constituencies in Turkey back then. So it was the ruling party, particularly President Erdogan and the Chief of General Staff in Turkey, they push for normalization. So now you cannot find those constituencies in Turkey. The military, the opposition, and the ruling party, they are all on the same page when it comes to anti-Americanism. So I think that's a major structural problem.
That's a great point. That's a really great point.
And when that is the case, and I think a similar picture exists here in Washington. The Pentagon, the U.S. military, they've always pushed for better ties with Turkey, but now I think they are skeptical about what Turkey is trying to do in Syria, in Idlib, for instance. So you cannot find, and on the Hill, there is a bipartisan consensus on not to tolerate Erdogan's actions anymore.
Right.
They're planning to slap sanctions. So it's become structural, and I think that's why it's now very difficult to overcome those contextual problems.
Let me bring the Gulf countries into this, because you also see increasing tensions between Turkey and Gulf countries. I mean, to the Qatar boycott, in Somalia, in Syria, all over the place. You see the recent comments by Mohammed bin Salman, including Turkey in a triangle of evil, which is quite a phrase. So I mean, again, where's the room for improvement here, if any?
Well, when I look at what Turkey is doing, where Turkey stands now in the region, it's become a very isolated country.
No problems
if you remember,
with neighbors. Only problems.
That's exactly right. I mean, look at Turkey-Egypt relations. There are no ambassadors there. Turkey-Israel relations. Look at the exchange of angry words, and obviously there are problems with Syria, even with Iran. Despite the close cooperation in Syria, there are just so many problems in Turkey-Iran relations, and also in Turkey-Russia relations too. And I know there are many people in Washington who think that, there's been a foreign policy shift in Turkey's foreign policy outlook. Now it's turning towards Russia. This is a strategic alliance. That's not the case at all. I think Turkey doesn't trust Russia enough, and Putin doesn't trust Erdogan enough. So this is a marriage of convenience, and partly because of Turkey's frustration with the U.S. And the other reason is Turkey is in a way desperate. So it really needs Russia, especially in Syria, but for other reasons too. So I think Turkey is too isolated in the region, and add to that the difficulties that Turkey is having with the Gulf countries. Erdogan accused the UAE of being behind the failed coup, and I recently saw a remark from the UAE.
Yeah, I was going to say, among many others.
It was a large coalition. And with the Saudis too, I mean, there are tensions. So for a long time, Barzani was about the only friend that Turkey had, and he's gone now. So that's why I was recently on a panel, and I received a question. Someone asked a question about Turkey's neo-Ottoman agenda, and I said, well, that's not realistic at all. Look where Turkey is. He cannot really talk about the neo-Ottoman agenda. So both in terms of, because of the missteps that Turkey took in the region, and also I think the Syrian conflict dealt a huge blow to Turkey's image, which was great right before the Syrian conflict. Turkey was a very popular country on the Arab streets, and that's not the case anymore.
Erdogan was popular personally. No, definitely not.
He's trying to revive that with his recent remarks
regarding Israel.
Israel,
sure.
But that's not going to work.
No, it's not going to work. So, from the Gulf countries' perspective now, they're at least MBS, and it would appear that this is informed by a certain kind of Emirati discourse as well. So you can say that at least 3 of the Gulf Arab countries have now embraced a certain model of regional relations as expressed in the Triangle of Evil comments, etc. So what do you think at least these 3 Gulf Arab countries we are trying to communicate to the rest of the world with that kind of rhetoric? And if you can talk a bit about the other 3 as well and where they fit in, that is to say Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar.
Right. So it seems to me that one of the real problems with the overarching framework of a Sunni Shia split in the Middle East is that the Sunnis never had their act together. Right. And I think that there was, and you're right, I think maybe to some extent driven by the United Arab Emirates, but in Saudi Arabia it was picked up, this notion that Turkey was representing with Qatar as a minor, well, not a minor, as an ally.
Sunni Islamist bloc,
that they were representing a Muslim Brotherhood perspective, kind of bottom-up, democratic, populist Islam. And that's clearly not something that monarchies are sympathetic with. And I think that the inability of the Saudis and the Turks to get on the same page in Syria was one of the drivers of the inability of the opposition to put more pressure on the Assad regime or even bring the regime down. And I think we did see that when briefly the Turks and the Saudis did get on the same page at the beginning of, at least I would read it, at the beginning of 2015 when Salman just comes in, that's when the Russians come in because they actually saw that there was a real threat to the Assad regime at that point. But this intra-Sunni, if you will, ideological divide, I think has been as important in many ways as the Sunni Shia tensions in mapping out who's with whom in the region, and it doesn't look like there's much effort to get beyond that.
Right. What about the future of the GCC itself as a regional bloc?
Right.
A tough one, but
yeah. I mean, so I think the Gulf Cooperation Council has always been a barometer of crisis. That is to say, when things were going all right, the Gulf countries could engage in, if you will, intramural spats. But when things were going badly, they would come together. And that now that pattern seems to have been broken now.
Right.
Even with the severe issues facing the Gulf states in the region and the upheavals that you mentioned at the beginning, in the past that would tend to bring the Gulf states together. But that isn't the case anymore. And I think that this has two major consequences. One kind of geopolitical and one more individual and personal in the Gulf itself. The geopolitical one is that, let's face it, the GCC was never a major player as a bloc. It's not NATO, right?
Right.
GCC, not NATO. You can all make a note of that.
Even NATO isn't NATO
Yeah,
anymore.
even NATO's not NATO anymore.
Not
The
anymore.
GCC was not even NATO then. But it provided us a cover for these individual countries to act, and to act with the United States in ways that it might have been less comfortable for them to do individually. And I think that that's done. I think that's done. And then at the individual level, I mean, the GCC did encourage some amount of, there had always been some amount of social interaction among these families in these various states. I mean, many of these families, of course, have branches in various of the states.
Sure.
But the GCC just kind of made it easy to get around. And now it's hard to get around. You know, there are marriages across the Saudi-Qatari border that are disrupted by this. And I think that that's you know, since those of us who travel the region occasionally know some of these people, that's a real shame. So yeah, I cannot see the GCC in anything like the near future coming back to be even at the level of importance and competence that it had achieved in before, say, 2010, 2011, 2012.
Okay. Speaking of barometers of crisis, Ambassador, Iraq relation with not just the Gulf, but with the broader Arab world has been, let's say, fraught, since it entered its latest iteration of modern nationhood after after 2003. And so I think what I'd like you to think about and talk to us about a little is the relationship of Iraq in the region, but not the region as a whole, the Arab world in particular. You know, so is the sense in part of the Arab world of Iraq as somehow distant from the rest of the Arab world? Is that exaggerated? Has it been exaggerated by the perception of many other Arabs that Iraq has kind of drifted away from much of the rest of the Arab world? Is that exaggerated? And if it's not wholly exaggerated, there's a lot to. What are the prospects of it integrating better into some kind of Arab conversation in the coming years?
Now, I mean, Iraq's natural position is, in my view, within the sort of larger Arab group of states. Again, not the bombastic or whatever role that it played under Saddam. But of course, the relations, not to be pedantic about a point, but naturally it goes back to 1990 when things obviously went wrong between Iraq and the Arab states, not just 2003. So. In 2003, there was a kind of an Arab rejection of the notion of the United States intervening in an Arab country and causing change and upheaval, and there was a sort of a rejection of that change, and I used to say to my colleagues when I was at the United Nations that your refusing to engage with us will cause Iran to have the upper hand because it will engage. It sees an opportunity, and it did. Again, one of the things that Abadi had managed to do was to recalibrate. I mean, he after the shall I call it kerfuffle with Qatar, Abadi managed to make a tour of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And I thought that was I really think that has to be the Iraqi attitude. Since the Turks aren't using the phrase, the Kemalist phrase, I think we need to adopt it: peace at home and peace abroad. And so I'm hopeful.
Don't change the alphabet.
Yeah, but I think that there will be pressure for Iraq to choose sides from both sides. And just knowing Iraqi history, we have a tendency, in 1958, we rejected the West and embraced the East, and to a significant extent in the post-2003 period, we had, particularly when Maliki was prime minister, we embraced Iran much too closely. There is a danger of that occurring. If I could comment on one thing, and I know you want time, we need to get to our audience, but there's one thing Greg said, which was that if I may rephrase it, and you correct me if I don't do you justice, but that in my words, the Shia-Sunni divide in the Middle East is perhaps exaggerated, because you said the Sunnah never quite got their act together. Well, by the way, at least speaking from an Iraqi perspective, the Shia never quite got their act together. And I think it's a mistake to think of them as a monolith. They're no more a monolith in Iraq, at least. And I would argue throughout the Gulf states, if we're going to talk, I mean, the situation in Bahrain with the Bahraini Shia is very different than, say, the Kuwaiti Shia, which is very different, again, from the Saudi Shia, etc., or the Emirati Shia. So I think that while I absolutely agree with Greg that the Sunnah have not been monolithic and obviously aren't in the Gulf now, given the crisis with Qatar, but I think it's also true that that's also true of the Shia as well.
My sense, by the way, just to throw you're absolutely right, but there is a kind of relative coherence to the pro-Iranian camp politically that the anti-Iranian camp doesn't have. That's not a sectarian division. That has to do with coalitions. And it seems to me, it seems to me that the active armed forces that are fighting in causes largely approved of by Iran are a lot more coherent, a lot more disciplined and on message and on point than those that are generally opposed to Iran, half of which don't talk to each other and hate each other and don't have diplomatic relations.
Right. There's only one major regional power. That's Shia. Right. And it has been able.
It's true.
To create a network of allies,
like-minded,
and clients. That allies that need the Iranians for their own purposes in these states that are suffering from civil war or rebuilding themselves, and some are clients. And my definition of a client is if the Iranians can deploy you outside of your borders for their purposes, then you're a client. And so that would be Hezbollah, that would be some Iraqi militias like AGSIW al-Haq, Afghan, the Fatimiyun, right? So I do think, that the Iranians have been better able to lead a bloc, if you will. Granted, each of those groups within that bloc have a specific relationship with Iran, some closer. The Houthis, not nearly as close as Hezbollah, right?
Right.
And Iraqi political parties that I think don't want to be the client of anyone, but needed the help of an external power while they were struggling to get a piece of the pie in the post-2003.
Do you want to respond?
My only point is, and very quickly, is that it's not purely sectarian. I mean, for instance, close relations between Hamas and Iran, at least at one point, it's not purely sectarian. It's political. It's geopolitical. That's my point.
And my one point is that I see sectarianism in the region as a bottom-up phenomenon, not a top-down phenomenon.
Absolutely right.
I think the Saudis and the Iranians are playing a pretty cold-blooded balance of power game. But I see in these divided societies that are undergoing civil war and reconstruction, I see sectarianism as a real political force, and thus their impulse is to look to sectarian partners abroad, which both the Iranians and the Saudis and the Turks and the Qataris and the Emiratis, right, are more than willing to exploit.
Let me bring the audience in. I really think we want to get your input, and thank you for your patience. We'll begin with you, ma'am, then we'll go back over here, and two back there, and then we'll go back to the other side. So, yeah, there should be. I believe there's one. Here it comes. Yeah, coming right now.
Raise your hand so I know.
Right here. Yellow shirt in the front, and then we're going to switch around over there to two hands over there. Yeah, if you could identify yourself and just ask a question. Of course.
I have a question for Professor Gause, and I have a question and a comment for my friend Feisal. Professor Gause, you...
Could you speak more loudly, please?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
sorry, I know our audience.
You talked about American expectations from the Gulf states in return for putting pressure on Iran and so on. And the fact that the Gulf states, you're quite right, are likely not to accept. Could you please elaborate on what the U.S. might do, how it might react when the Gulf states don't accept? What will the U.S. do?
Great question.
No.
And you had a second question?
Yes, for Ambassador Istrabadi.
Please.
First of all, I'd like to remind you that Muqtada al-Sadr went to the Gulf states before Haidar al-Abadi did.
That's true, he did. And also Saudi Arabia. Yes,
And Saudi Arabia and so on.
Yep.
So,
That's right.
And that's a very important indicator.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And Jordan.
And I mean, he's been everywhere. I can't even, we should think of the places where he hasn't been.
Johnny Cash.
Sorry?
Johnny Cash. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
The other things, I do take issue when you say that things will continue as before, because I think when the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, followed by the statements of Secretary Pompeo, and also the iffy situation of Iran and Syria, because it's not at all clear that their relations, that they're on the same page with the Russians and so on. It seems to me that Iran now has much more at stake in Iraq. And of course, the fact that the Arab countries, the Gulf countries, are beginning to make their voices heard, they're making inroads. I think the Iranians are now going to play a much more aggressive game in Iraq.
I couldn't agree.
And therefore, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I think this is something that we have to take into account, and it will probably complicate the situation in a worse way than the previous 4 years. The previous 4 years we had ISIS, and that was just dreadful and so on. But I mean political complication as opposed to security. And by the way, we may end up, as a consequence of those political complications, with different types of security issues.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. So let's begin with the one to Professor Gause. What the reaction?
Sure, just and shortly, so we can get a bunch of questions. You know, in the past, the United States has been disappointed by the reactions of the Gulf states to various American initiatives. But we've had administrations that basically said, but we have long-term interests here, we have long-term relationships with these states, and so we just have to live with it. We can try to cajole them to bring them along. I don't know if this administration has that sense. I mean, it seems much more immediately transactional. I can't imagine that if you're going to run a foreign policy that's directed against Iran, about pressuring Iran, that you can afford not to have at least good, if not correct, relations with the Gulf states, because that's where American military forces are stationed. And so I think that in the end, the Pentagon, as it frequently does in American relations with the Gulf, the Pentagon will bring the White House back from whatever punishments the White House might have thought of for the Gulf states.
Great point. Ambassador, what about Iran's, the stakes have gone up for Iran.
Yes. What I thought I was saying, and perhaps didn't or misspoke, is that the domestic political arrangement, the domestic political machinations are likely to be the same as opposed to those who, the 45% who voted, presumably were hoping for something different, particularly. So in that sense, I don't think there'll be much change. Of course, Iran has far more levers to press or to manipulate in Iraq than the Gulf states. For Iran, I think the ideal situation in Iraq was Nouri Maliki's Iraq in 2013. Not the chaos of 2014 in ISIL, but instability or not stability, which isn't quite the same as instability, I suppose, and tensions between the various communities, political communities, and as well as other types of communities in Iraq. That's not going to change. They will have the ability, as I said, to manipulate levers that I think Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states don't have in Iraq. They'll have an ability to be more subtle. There is, however, I think, at some point, a kind of political check, and that is, and there's a certain irony in me appealing to them, but in the clerical establishment in Najaf. The Iranians, I think, have been careful on the whole, at least in public, not to be in obvious opposition to the Najaf Marja'iyya, the clerical establishment. And we'll see whether, of course, Sistani is not, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani is no longer a spring chicken and there's no obvious successor. So we'll see whether that has the ability to continue to act at some level in subtle ways as a check on too much overt Iranian influence in Iraq. That, I suppose, is also declining by virtue of Grand Ayatollah Sistani's age. But no, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that things will go on as far as Iran is concerned. I understand that, of course, it is going to ratchet up the withdrawal from the JCPOA and the apparent intention to sort of confront Iran directly in some of the rather bellicose rhetoric we're hearing. As I said, I think Iraq is one of the battlegrounds. And I'm very concerned about that.
I love that. We're going to go back over here. I love the Pentagon and Najaf being, both kind of checks in their various places. That's a wonderful echo. Bill? Yeah, and then we'll go next.
I forget who wrote it. There was Bill Lawrence, George Washington University. There was a famous article on the Turkey, Iran, Russia triangle, and sort of using that as one gauge for studying everything we've been talking about today. I think this panel's done a really good job of right-sizing how we look at Turkey and its relative failures, and right-sizing how we look at Iran and its relative successes. But I'd like to ask Gregory about Russia.
Yeah. Great question.
And in the context of China, Iran, what's Russia and Iran going to look like going forward, and how is that going to affect Russia's efforts with the Arab countries? How do we right-size understanding Russia's position?
Excellent.
Do you want to collect some, or do you want me to just go?
Let me get you to answer that, and then we'll do a batch after that. But this is a big
So I'm a little out of my lane because I don't claim to have any special understanding of what drives Russian foreign policy. But it does seem to me that the Russians have a lot of problems in the region. In the same way that the United States couldn't organize the region at the height of its powers, right? We couldn't organize the region the way we wanted to. Russia, which is, I would say, no longer a great power, no longer a global power, much more a regional power. And the Middle East is, of course, a close region to Russia, which is why it's involved there. But Russia doesn't have the tickets to play an organizing role, much less a hegemonic role or a quasi-hegemonic or a desirous of being a hegemonic role. I think Russian interests are going to be squeezed, right? Because if they throw in completely with Iran, they have problems with Saudi Arabia, and actually cooperation with Saudi Arabia on oil questions is pretty important for Russia these days. If they throw in completely with Turkey, then they have problems with Iran. And they might have problems with kind of the post, I don't want to say post-Civil War, but in the next phase of Syrian politics. It seems to me that they have as many problems as we have. They just have fewer, they had fewer interests involved and they concentrated on them, right? And that interest, that primary interest was the Assad regime. And I think that had a lot to do with how the Russians see their own, they see the threat, to them the threat emerging from the Middle East to them is Salafi jihadism. Right? I don't think they see anything else coming out of the Middle East as a direct threat to them. But Salafi jihadism is because it's a domestic phenomenon, right?
That's right.
And for them, right, to see the Assad regime fall with the possibility of Salafi jihadist successor regime and with the rise of ISIS, they had a pretty good sense of what their interest was. Now that the Assad regime is secured, basically, the ISIS threat is much reduced. I think the Russians are going to have the same kind of issues of, you know, how much is this worth to us, and, you know, if we go this way, these people won't like us. My bottom line on Russia is they don't have the tickets to be a major power in the Middle East, and we should definitely not over-exaggerate their role there.
Excellent. So I'm going to take three. We're going to begin over there. And we're going to, okay, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3. And then, and we'll take them, write them down.
Just to follow on the question of Russia, now the focus on Iran. To preface this, at last fall's conference with National Arab-U.S. Policymakers Council, one of the attachés from the Saudi embassy mentioned that they'd rather have a hardline Iranian government than one that's a so-called moderate, given that they're much more likely to play the good cop, bad cop routine as a moderate. So the question is, and this for all of you, since it'll affect the whole region, that let's say the failure of the JCPOA, if that then shifts Iran into a more overtly hardline direction in terms of domestic politics, what effect would that have? Would it be would the Saudis actually have an easier hand with that, or,
good question.
Or Turkish, or would it even complicate the
Good.
matters
Excellent.
further?
That's great. Okay, so that's one. Now we'll go over here. I'm going to take the second, and then the third, and then we'll answer this. Good start.
Second is?
Right here, behind you. Keep going. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, Caroline Tynan from Temple University.
A little louder, please.
Caroline Tynan from Temple University. This question's for...
Go Owls. I'm a St. Joe's grad, so I don't really mean go Owls. Go Hawks.
Well, so this question's for Professor Gause. Something you said earlier about the intervention in Yemen, and I just wanted you to clarify whether, were you saying that the Saudi intervention in Yemen is not so much reflective of a more aggressive foreign policy, or that way of looking at it is an exaggeration, because as you point out, they still, as in past interventions in Yemen and elsewhere, they're not so much using ground troops. They're relying on the Emiratis for that.
No,
and
it's a good question.
And if I may, for a
yes,
second,
you can.
You also, one of the last things you said was you see the rising sectarianism in the region as being a bottom-up and not a top-down phenomenon. If you could just speak a little more to that as well.
Okay, we've got one more. We're actually going to go to the back, and then we'll begin with you in the next round.
Thanks very much. Alan Makovsky, Center for American Progress.
Sure.
Question for Dr. Gause. I apologize, maybe there's too much gossip embedded in this question for you to comment, but it really does seem that the Trump administration threw the Saudis and the UAE a curve on the Qatar issue. It seemed they were put up to taking a strong stance against Qatar, and then the administration did a 180. And I was just in the region, and I think I heard some overtones, nothing explicit, regarding that. And I just wonder how you think that affects the equation of U.S. Saudi/UAE relations. And for Dr. al-Istrabadi, I just wonder, asking as kind of a novice about Iraqi politics, how does Sadr's history of a strong stance against the U.S. presence and his newfound influence, how is that going to be factored into the future of the U.S. presence in Iraq?
Let's, if we may, let's take them in reverse order and begin. Ambassador, what about Muqtada's history of anti-Americanism and its potential role here?
Well, I mean, he's had a very, I don't know what to call it, interesting, I guess is the most anodyne word I can choose, interesting history. He has always had, since he came to the, well, he actually first came to the public attention accused of ordering the murder of Abdelmajid al-Khoui, of course, in on the 10th of April, 2003. But when he came to the sort of forefront as a political figure, he had a pan-Iraqi rhetoric, which he still has. I hesitate to use the word nationalist in the current environment we find many countries in. I don't want to be given the wrong impression. Don't want to give the wrong impression. But he had a kind of a pan-Iraqi discourse. And you may remember when the Americans did sort of a medieval siege of Fallujah, surrounding Fallujah, and so on. He actually did blood drives and what have you for the relief of Fallujah, and ultimately sort of began a kind of insurrection at the same time. But we also ought to remember that the militia he had, which has since been disbanded, Jaish al-Mahdi, committed the atrocities against Baghdad Sunnah in 2006 and 2007. Now he emerges, and he was one of the ones who said there should be no American presence in 2008. But on the other hand, that was also the position of the then Prime Minister of the day, and more or less the entire political. He has generally taken the position now that in this incarnation of Muqtada al-Sadr that all foreign influences should be reduced in Baghdad amongst all political parties. So, now of course he himself is not going to be a member of parliament. He is not going to be a responsible individual. So he will have the luxury of always being able to criticize whatever comes next. But that's his, what he does in the future is very difficult to predict because in my view he has rather an erratic past. Erratic, sorry. That came out slightly wrong. I know nothing about that part of his personality, certainly not that I'm willing to reveal here.
Awesome.
If I could get in on a question that isn't for me, but I disagreed with Greg when he said it, if I may.
Please.
And that is that the sectarianism is bottom up. And again, I won't argue about well, actually, I sort of will. In Iraq, the sectarianism has not only been top-down, the primary drivers, in my opinion, maybe Ran will disagree, but the primary drivers of sectarianism in Iraq initially certainly were expatriate Iraqis who went back to hold positions in the country, who came from various parties. And I hold, by the way, and my name is Al-Istrabadi, so I can do this, I hold the Shia religious parties principally responsible. The response of the Sunnah was that, a response. But you know, I don't know if rank-and-file Saudis really want Shia clerics hanged for no particularly good reason. I don't know if rank-and-file Bahrainis really want the Shia of Bahrain to have their citizenships revoked. These are things the elites are doing. It's the elites that have prevented in the kingdom Shia from being appointed, say, in foreign ministries, etc., historically, and what have you. I'm not so sure it isn't, even in the Gulf states, an elite-driven process.
Fair enough. You just want to have that as a comment, or? Well, I'll tell you what. If you want to address that, you can. But let me say there are two, at least, questions that it seems to me that you certainly could address. One is, has the United States done a 180 on Qatar, and what's the American role right now on the Qatar boycott? And we can also think maybe a bit about the role of the Yemen intervention in Saudi Arabia's foreign policy in general.
Sure.
Yeah.
So briefly on the Qatar thing, because we just don't know where it is. It's way too early. Obviously, the White House is singing a different tune than it was at the beginning a year ago, right? In this crisis. What effect that's going to have, I don't know, because it seems to me there has to be, concerted follow-up if you want to get this thing done. And what could have been done more easily within weeks of the split, I think will be much harder to do now that it's taken a whole year and attitudes have solidified. So the Yemen intervention is certainly something different than what the Saudis have done in the past. Their instruments for affecting Yemeni policy in the past were much more non-kinetic, if you will, right? They were money, they were political influence, right? But I think that it would be a mistake to go from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other, that the evidence of the Saudis willing to use force in Yemen means that they've become little Sparta, right? To steal the term that Secretary Mattis uses for the Emirates, which I also think is an exaggeration. I've been to the Emirates. I don't see it as Sparta. I just think it's a mistake for us to read, kind of to extrapolate from a greater willingness of the Saudis to use force in what they see as their exclusive sphere of influence in Yemen, to, they'll be willing to use force in other arenas in the region. The bottom-up, top-down thing. When political authority falls apart, people have to look somewhere for safety, for security, right? They have to look somewhere for people who aren't going to kill their children when they go out to school, where people will give them food and shelter if necessary. And in a lot of the places in the Eastern Arab world, for historical reasons that everybody in this audience knows, the communities where people feel that security are sectarian. Now, not everywhere, right? Kurds are both Sunnis and Shia, but have this sense of, if you will, an ethno-national identity. And so when authority falls apart, you rush to your Kurdish identity. In a place like Libya, where the state fell apart, right? There's no sectarian differences, so where do people run? right? They run to tribe, they run to clan, they run to location
Yep.
for that sense of security and safety. That's what I mean as sectarianism being a bottom-up phenomenon. And when I say bottom-up, I don't mean that elites don't exploit it. Of course they do. I mean, elites are political entrepreneurs. They're going to go. They're going to try to find their support wherever they can. I just kind of push back against the notion that Iran and Saudi Arabia are forcing a sectarian template on what are basically political power struggles. When I see political power struggles in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, right, and the state falls apart, sectarianism is one of the identities that emerges as being more salient. And that's what I mean by bottom up.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to exonerate the Saudis or the Iranians in this. They are exploiting these feelings, but I don't think they're creating them.
No, I think your point is well taken. So, Dr. Toll, let me ask you about the rise of a more hardline, a more aggressive Iranian government, given the pressure that Iran is starting to come under. And if you can talk about that in general, and especially Turkey's likely response to that.
Well, I guess it depends on what a hardline Iran would do. I mean, if it decides to go nuclear, obviously that's a major concern for Turkey, especially if it prompts a regional nuclear arms race. That's a scenario where Egypt and the Saudis get their own nuclear program. So that's a scenario that Turkey has been trying to avoid. So I think that's a nightmare scenario. But if and of course it also depends on what Iran will do in Iraq and also in Syria. When Iran was isolated, but in terms of domestic dynamics, it really, I think, it doesn't matter for Turkey. Turkey worked well with an isolated Iran. When the US and EU slapped sanctions between 2011 and 2015, Turkey worked well. But this time it could be even more difficult, given Turkey had to establish a scheme that involved its state-owned banks to evade Iran sanctions, and now that became a case in New York. So I think now Turkey will be in a difficult spot, but still I think it will all depend on what specific actions Iran will take in Iraq and Syria. Of course, there's always competition between the two countries in Iraq and in Syria. Despite the three, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, being part of the Astana trio, and they've created de-escalation zones, but there are still troubles between the two, Turkey and Iran. Recently, Turkey just set up its last observation point in Idlib, for instance. And the aim there is to be able to, in a way, Turkey created a buffer zone between the Iranian-backed forces and the opposition, but Iran can always spoil that, and it has done so, despite Russia, by the way. So that's why Turkey is, what Iran does in Syria in response to that isolation, I think it's important for Turkey. But other than that, on trade, on energy, Turkey will keep working with Iran.
An excellent answer, and we've already dealt with Iran's role in Iraq, unless you wanted to add something, and with Saudi Arabia.
One observation I haven't made that I'd like to before
and then we're going to wrap it up.
Of course, my greatest fear for Iran's vision for Iraq is sort of the Hezbollahization of Iraq. And there are significant steps. I mean, we're significantly along the way to that in any event, where sort of the government in Baghdad has international personality and more or less acts as kind of the mayoralty of Baghdad. But real power, the residuum of power, lies in non-state actors. And it's, of course, these PMUs would take the place. And the difference being that there's a kind of cohesion in Lebanon, in Hezbollah, that in Iraq it's cacophonous with multiple, some of which are, I'll accept a word I didn't accept when you started it, proxies, but having listened, I'll accept a word who are much closer to being clients than allies. That really worries me about and that becomes, it seems to me, more important to Iran as the temperature in the Middle East is driven up.
Very good. I think I'm going to go with one last question because you were patient, sir. I think you had a question. I don't want to cut you off. And then we'll wrap up with that. So please go right ahead.
One for each of us.
Gentleman right here. No? Yeah, there you go.
My first question for Dr. Feisal. Dr. Feisal, seriously, do you believe that Muqtada Sadr is an Iraqi nationalist, or he is part of the conflict or the disagreements between the Shia institutions in Iran? Dr. Gönül, you talked about the past of Turkey, but what about after June election? Do you believe there will be some change, even if it's a minor change?
In Turkey's foreign policy?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Greg,
Whoa, 3 in 1. Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the assurance, what's the guarantees that the Iranians, they are not reflecting or reacting against the U.S. decision to withdraw from the nuclear program? The reaction will be in Iraq and Syria. Thank you.
Okay, well, that gives one final question to each of our guests, which is just perfect.
Yeah.
It makes my life easier. So let's begin again. Let's take them in this time chronological order and begin with Muqtada Sadr. And is he a nationalist? I can't imagine you know that, but his role anyway.
I was very careful to say, I think, that he has used the rhetoric of pan-Iraqism. And I put it that way for a reason, and that is, of course, I have my doubts, and I also referenced the Jaish al-Mahdi and its heinous acts in Baghdad in 2006 and 7. So no, I have no particular. I'm not particularly buoyed by his nationalist credentials. But he's tapped in, I think, and here's again on this top-down, bottom-up, or whatever it is, he's tapped into I think one of the reasons 55% of Iraqis nationwide stayed home is because they're tired of the sectarian discourse. There are many reasons, but I think that's one of them. So he's tapped in now to this narrative, this, again, pan-Iraqi narrative, to this anti-corruption narrative, to this narrative of delivering services. And this he has ridden to relative victory. I mean, his group, if it holds itself together, and it's a very disparate list, his coalition, is the number one list by a fairly, 8, 9 seats, whatever it is. So, no, I'm not convinced of his nationalist credentials, but he is certainly using that rhetoric again.
Yeah, so it shows that there's a national constituency, if nothing else. Whether he may not be genuine, but the appeal is.
That's right.
Okay, that's great. So what about Turkey after the June election? The great question.
Well, of course, certain things will change, others won't. The opposition is saying that if they're elected on June 24th, they will make peace with the Assad regime and they will pursue a less aggressive foreign policy in the region and fix relations with the EU, the US. So of course, the problems that Turkey is facing at the moment, some of them are due to, relates to Erdogan's outlook. Didn't want to use the word ideology, but and others are about what the conditions on the ground are dictating. So in that sense, there are certainly things that the opposition, if there's a change in power, opposition can do. With the European Union, for instance, I think the fact that Erdogan is not in the picture, if the opposition manages to put Turkish democracy back on track, I think there could be positive developments in Turkey-EU relations, but that's not the entire picture. The EU has its own problems, and there are many other problems in that relationship. With the US, as I explained, there are problems in Syria. Again, it's really not easy to make peace with the Assad regime. So I think the key here, especially in Turkey's regional policy, will be whether the opposition is willing to solve Turkey's Kurdish problem. If it manages to find a resolution, peaceful resolution, I think it will automatically fix many problems that Turkey is having in its regional policy.
Great. And the last word goes to you, Professor.
Thanks. I think the Iranians are very cautious about confronting the United States. I don't think that they have any interest whatsoever in a direct confrontation with the United States. And I think that they have every interest in trying to keep the Europeans away from the United States in terms of sanctions, right? And I think that, in many ways, in the short term, the Iranians are going to be on their best behavior. But if things escalate and there are actual military strikes by the United States on Iran or by the Israelis on Iran, then I think that what the Iranians do is respond asymmetrically. Mm-hmm. They don't want a direct military confrontation with either Israel or the United States because they know they wouldn't win. But what they can do is exploit fissures in societies throughout the Middle East. Mm-hmm. It could be in Iraq, it could be in Bahrain, it could be in Saudi Arabia, right? It could be in Lebanon, in ways that would harm the United States interests, or if the Israelis are involved, Israeli interests. Mm-hmm. But I think my read of the Iranians is they're going to keep their powder dry. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, it's the U.S. that's isolated right now. I mean, we'll see how the Europeans move. But right now, the U.S. is isolated. We're the ones who left the agreement, not them. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the Iranians will be smart enough to basically say, we would love to have good relations with the P5, and we would love to have good, and we're going to keep our side of this agreement. And in that sense, I don't see them as kind of reacting right away. I think they'll be reacting in Iraq for reasons that have nothing to do with JCPOA. Mm-hmm. I think that has to do with their view of Iraq and the gains that they've made in Iraq. But and that would have happened whether JCPOA was on or off. But I think that in terms of a confrontation with America, they're going to keep their powder dry. And
you don't think it makes them more desperate in Iraq and other regional battlegrounds?
Not yet.
Okay. Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our panel. Terrific stuff.